Alright, this is going to be another video that basically is dealing with World War II revisionism. Again, I think World War II is probably the single most historical event that needs the most revisionism. And when I say that, I don't mean lies or propaganda. I mean the introduction of heretofore usually or discounted historical evidence because it World War II is essentially the basis of the competing civic religion in the United States. On the one hand, you have a classically liberal minarchist, certainly not perfect, tradition most epitomized by the founding fathers, and I realize that's a problematic term for any number of reasons. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, again, a very, very flawed document, although the Declaration of Independence, I think, is pretty sound. And you have that vision, which is one of, the idea that government is maybe necessary, but also potentially very evil and destructive, and so it should have a very constrained role within society, and that the rest of the society should not only be larger and more vibrant than the state, but should be actively engaged in restricting and watching out against the state, to basically be anti-government. But then you have this other competing idea, which was present all from the beginning as well, but did not have as much political clout as it eventually was to gain. And that's the idea that the government is a progressive social institution, one that has the potential to achieve wonderful things, whether that be in the areas of, say, regulation, education, making the world safe for democracy, equality, any number of other essentially politically correct buzzwords, and that as such, well, we should have a big government. It's a good thing to have a big government. And these are mutually exclusive ideologies. Maybe they overlap a little bit, but they have areas that are not exclusive, or that can't be squared with each other. And World War II is a central empirical data point in the myth of the efficacy of a big government, basically. Now, a lot has been said, and I think known by people who watch my channel, not because they watch me so much, but probably because they listen to the same people as me, in terms of why the United States involvement in World War II was not the, let's say, unquestionable crusade of righteousness that it is made out to be. The United States was, for all practical purposes, engaged in war with Germany and Japan prior to our involvement, and goaded them to the point that eventually they did commit the first act, but that's not really true because we were already committing numerous first acts prior to that. But the American public was largely unaware or uninterested in that fact. So I don't want to rehash all of that. I will say, if you look on the Mises Media site, look for the most recent lecture by Robert Higgs. He goes through basically the lead up to Pearl Harbor, and what he's talking about isn't conspiracy theorists. It's not the stuff that some whack author made up and tried to popularize on his blog. Information showing the complicity of the United States government in, at the very least, provoking Japan, if not knowing that it was going to be attacked and not doing anything, has been known since the 50s, and just the scholarship has not wanted to make a big deal of it. And I've got several of the books. These are, pull this out. I mean, this is an old book here. I haven't read this one, but it says Pearl Harbor: The Story of the Secret War. This is by a mainstream historian, written in the 50s. I got another one here. Looks a little bit newer. Betrayal at Pearl Harbor. And probably a whole bunch of other ones. not to mention the work of Robert Stinnett, the likes of that. But what I wanted to talk about here was another aspect of this, and that is the Holocaust. Now, I've made one Holocaust video before this, basically where I was wondering about it, basically along the lines of the Germans were engaged in mass homicide. Any way you slice it, this homicide did target certain ethnic groups, Jews, but also Slavs, Czechs, Poles, communists. That's not really an ethnic group, and they deserve it, but another story. And gypsies and several other groups, but the idea that they would just be mass killing Jews, it seems a little strange given their enormous labor problems. So this is also interesting. That's the only video I have that's been flagged. In fact, if you try and watch it, it says it's mature, but it's pretty, there's not much to it. That is a clear indication of Zionists out there trying to protect their foundational myth about the Holocaust. And just a word on that, the Jews in Israel, very, very, very few of them can have any plausible connection to the Holocaust, other than perhaps aiding and abetting it. Earlier on, the Nazis pursued a policy of expelling the Jews. This was made difficult because they wanted to take their money, and so they placed extremely high taxes on people who would emigrate from Germany, especially Jews. And since they put such high taxes on it, it meant fewer people left. And this was actually a problem that they worked out quite a bit. But they came up with a situation where they would send them, in coordination with Ben-Gurion and the other initial Zionists, that they would send them Jews when they could. It's not to say that the Zionists in Israel wanted the Holocaust to happen, but they were happy to work with Nazis when it suited their ends, which makes them pragmatic, I suppose, but also doesn't say much for their continuing victimization rhetoric. I also think it's pathetic for them to think that they can flag people's videos and think that people aren't going to hear alternative views to the Holocaust. But anyway, while I was at work, I read this book, The Wages of Destruction. This is an excellent book, and I also note that it is well recommended, highly rated. Boston Globe, the Times of London, the New York Sun, the Financial Times. This is a mainstream academic book. In fact, if I look at the side of it here, I bought this used textbook. So this was assigned reading at a school, at a university at some point. I don't know which one, and I don't know how common that is, but this is fairly mainstream. It's written maybe about 10 years ago, and it has added a lot of information to my views on the Holocaust and Germany in World War II. One thing, though, I will point out, he talks about a lot of stuff that I'd already heard from the almost completely blacklisted scholar Anthony C. Sutton, the author of the Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution and Wall Street and Hitler books, and the author of the Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development books. These guys. I was just watching an interview with him of Stanley Monteith. If you want to see it on YouTube, just type Anthony C. Sutton interview, you'll see it. He is talking about this stuff, and the interview was done in 1980, and he is citing like literally the same chemicals exchanged from Standard Oil to IG Farben in Germany that this guy is talking about here, and this guy gets all this credit, and he's this, oh, this is a major contribution. And Anthony C. Sutton, way more technical, way better sourced, but it's there also. So I thought that was interesting. But anyway, the takeaways of this book is that the way Americans tend to see it is that Germany launched this aggressive racist war, and too bad for them, they picked a fight with the United States, which they didn't realize was the sleeping giant and was going to pummel them. And this is not true, because everyone in Germany realized that the United States was a sleeping giant. In fact, Hitler's entire ideology of creating a Lebensraum was to create a state that was capable of autarky, a state that had enough resources within its own borders and a large enough market within its borders that it could have uh, large scale enough production that it would be able to resist an onslaught from a country like the United States. The United States is sort of the archetype state that Hitler wanted. If you read Mein Kampf, he's rather laudatory about the United States. And it was his view, and this was a view that a lot of European nationalists, not just those in Germany, had, that the United States was the new hegemon, and that if they didn't do something quick, they would lose the window of opportunity to ever be in a position to become anything other than a satellite for Germany, for the United States. And so World War II is essentially the final European land grab. Obviously, the British established their vast empire, the French theirs, the Russians theirs, and the Germans attempted to start one that got forestalled by World War I. And basically Hitler's thinking, since he doesn't believe in free trade or Bastiat's dictum that you can have goods changing borders instead of armies, believed that Germany would have to have territorial control, either direct annexation or via colonies, in order to have any hope of being something other than a political satellite of either the United States or the USSR. And World War II is essentially an attempt to realize this. An extremely risky and ultimately futile attempt to do this, but this is something that they probably realized. In the context of the Holocaust, prior to World War II and for the first 2 years, the emphasis was on deportation, perhaps sterilization, although it didn't get as large scale as it would have need to have been, and ghettoization. They basically would confine the Jews to ghettos. After the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, the desperation of the German war economy and the German military in waging that conflict was such that they basically made a decision before the invasion even happened that for there to be any chance to avoid mass starvation in Germany, all agricultural goods in conquered areas of Russia, especially in the Ukraine, would have to be sent back to Germany, and that they would need the peasants in Russia to harvest this, but the urban populations in Russia, they just could not afford to be fed. By the number of people they took under their control, we're talking about anywhere between 20 and 40 million people. This is the so-called hunger plan, which is explicitly, we just can't afford to feed these people. They're just going to have to die. And as it turned out, the famine was not that terrible, although millions of people did die. Many Russian or German generals noted that the population of the USSR seemed very accustomed to famine, which was something that they found intriguing, which we know to be the fact that Russia would have been going through famine from World War I on, basically. Not everywhere all the time, but quite often in many areas. Also, the edict could not be fully enforced. Many commanders viewed that if they, say, cut off an entire city, say Minsk, for instance, and allowed no food to enter that city, well, they would starve eventually, but before they did, they'd probably cause a revolt of some type, and they just assumed that didn't happen, so they allowed there to be a trickle in. But the precedent was set to just say, okay, if we can't take care of these people, if we can't harness them for our ends, then they should just be killed. And this was accompanied, since they were going to do this hunger plan as they conquered territory, units of the SS especially, but these were often aided by the Wehrmacht proper, would go into an area and be like, okay, these people are going to die anyway. They'd kill all the communists, all the Jews, all the commissars, although I think the commissars deserved it. And once you open that genie, then it becomes very hard to put it in. Once you've started executing people for those reasons, and then you have these big ghettos full of Jews, and it's like, well, what are we going to do with them? It becomes obvious. You shouldn't just leave them there being useless eaters, as Malthus would say. It just becomes much more simple philosophically to just get rid of them. And so that's what they did. Now, I think that they tried as much as they could to use them as slave labor and work them to death, although the calories they gave them was such that they would never be productive workers, and that was probably counterproductive. But you know, the pressures put on them were quite astounding. Um, the productive capacity of the Soviet Union was equal to that of Germany. Actually, it surpassed Germany slightly in 1942-43. Germany was eventually able to increase production to the point where it passed the USSR in 1944, but that's not counting the UK, which was outproducing Germany, and the United States, which was outproducing everybody else put together. So this was a really good book. It talks a lot about Albert Speer. It kind of discredits the notion that he was this miracle worker who increased production. The Germans, in their desperation, before Albert Speer took over armaments industry, basically decided we can't really develop that much new equipment. We can't have new models of planes. There were a couple programs they continued, although on a desultory basis, and they said, we know this war is going to last a while longer now, so we're going to, and this is actually before the invasion of Russia, when they failed to, after the fall of France, there was a stalemate with Britain, and they said, okay, well, we have no means to defeat Britain in the near term. So we're going to need a big air force and a big navy to eventually, in several years, be able to defeat them. So they didn't build as many tanks and whatnot in order to build larger capacity for a longer war. So that took about a year. By the time Albert Speer came to power in 1942, this larger productive base had been established, and lo and behold, it did produce more than it had been previously. That's not really to say anything to him. He just got to inherit that. But the cost of this was that the technology they used was old. So that's why they were using ME-109s all through the entire war. Really, it was a good book, and it did change my views on the Holocaust a little bit. I mean, I always assumed that they were killing people, but this gave some rationale to why the shift from deportation to murder on a wide scale. But it also pointed out that the initial population to be murdered were Slavs, and for some reason there's no Holocaust for Soviets done by the Nazis or by the Soviet government, for that matter, which is interesting. And then, I think I brought it up before. This is something, if I have any German subscribers or German-speaking subscribers, I'd be really interested to know. I bought this book because it's apparently the only book that covers this topic, but I cannot read German, and it's in German. This guy right here. This is about the mass re-education of the Germans after the war by the Western powers, basically to guilt them into thinking everything was their fault. And you know what? A lot does fall on the people's shoulders who were alive then. Nothing can be said about people who were born subsequently. But you know, I think Americans made a lot of mistakes too. So, all right, I think that's pretty much it, and I'll talk to you later.